So global energy markets have always been transitioning to sort of the renewable energy sector. But a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, you can think of Germany, were locked in a bit of a standstill, had political inertia, a sense of complacency, were getting a lot of their oil and gas from Russia. Everybody snapped out of it on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Right? And then you look at Germany, a country who was traditionally, I just use it as a case study, sort of so reliant on Russia for natural gas, is now using renewables as a way to mitigate the gap that's left in their energy budgets, right? So Germany had initially a target of 65% of renewables in its energy makeup by 2030. That's recently been upgraded by 15% to 80%. So that's a pretty, decent margin. That's just taking one country. There's been more significant impact across sort of the European economy. And then you look at what's happening in the Middle East, and in that war, they're reshaping energy markets as well through a slightly different way. Because again, energy security is front and center. There's not that much oil that directly passes, say, through Gaza or Israel or Palestine. But what it is it's very close to the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea. Something like 30 million barrels a day of oil passes through the Red Sea, in addition to 15% of all global trade, right? Every single day. And then you've got the Houthi rebels just nearby. And the fact that this war is now becoming a much hotter and regional conflict, one that encompasses pretty much the entirety of the Middle East, isn't just isolated to the small strip of Gaza. Means that effectively any company that has any exposure to any goods passing through the Strait of Hormuz is directly impacted by what happens in this war and what sort of its consequences are to the energy markets. And because energy security again is front and center over there, that's leading countries to adopt increased investment in renewable energies as a stopgap for when their traditional supply chains fall through. The biggest risk for US-China relations is precisely what happens on November 5th at the American elections. And we're filming this at a time when there's less than 30 days to go. I don't know, by the time that it's out, it might have already been decided. But if you look at anything close to what Trump is saying, something like 60% tariffs is his proposed policy on every single good and service coming in from China. I mean, number one, that's something that instantly thrusts the world into economic recession. But even if he doesn't do the full extent of it, even if he just increases the tariffs that he put in place in his first presidency, that were maintained by Biden during his term, it does mean that we're going to see significant sort of macroeconomic shocks, right? For one, inflation will go up considerably, right? The same kind of inflation that renewable energy supply chains are really sensitive to, which means investment could sort of significantly be impacted. But secondly, just because the US wages a trade war doesn't mean that China is going to reciprocate in the same terms. China might reciprocate by targeting the US where it hurts most. And a lot of that is in the critical minerals, the rare earth minerals, the raw materials sector. China processes about 80% of the world's critical minerals that are absolutely key components in electric vehicles, in lithium batteries, in making solar panels, in making windmills. And without these key components coming in from China, not only would the US not be able to meet its voluntary climate goals that it set under the Paris Agreement, which Trump might also pull itself out of, but secondly, it'll hurt its national strategic interests, right? It'll raise the price of electricity. It might influence the US to regress on some of its promises on renewable investments. So I think that kind of in its totality, precisely what happens at the American elections, whether or not and to what degree Trump actually puts in place the tariffs on China that he's promised, and how China reacts to that, and to what degree they really choose to hurt the US where it hurts most, is how that's going to impact renewable energy markets. So I think yes and no. Yes, in the sense that fossil fuels traditionally are a monopolized or oligopolized resource, right? Only a few countries naturally have access to fossil fuels, to coal, to oil, to gas. And only a few countries also have the infrastructure and energy and sort of investment to build supply chains around that. And what that results in is entire blocks of countries becoming critically dependent on singular countries, bad faith players like Russia in particular, as we saw in the last 2 years, to keep their electricity grids on. And renewable energies change that dynamic completely, because in theory, with enough investment, technology, and infrastructure growth, you could have sort of clean energy resources in many more countries, right? To put it really bluntly, the sun shines and the wind blows in far more parts of the world than have oil and gas. And so what that means is as countries become more sort of energy independent, as they phase in more renewable energy into their energy mix, they also continue to pursue more independent foreign policy. They have less reasons to be strategically attached to a much bigger player like the US, the China, or Russia. And that's already happening in the rise of what you might call sort of swing state actors, right? Swing states on a kind of on a global scale, on an international level. You think of India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia. These countries don't just subscribe to the ideological blocks of the Cold War. They're increasingly making their own foreign policies because, frankly, there's not enough levers that the big powers have to push them on when they don't actually meet or align with some of their agenda goals. So I think, to sort of sum it all up, the shift towards renewables takes a unipolar world that's already turning multipolar and accelerates that transformation much faster to a world where you have multiple decentralized sources of power, a world possibly that's more resilient to energy shocks than the one before.